Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Harmon Museum, the June Lunch and Learn. I am John Zimkus. I am the Education Director and Historian here at the Harmon Museum. We have some things going on I thought you should know about. Our sampler exhibit, Samplers for a Simpler Time, will be still up for the rest of the week. So if you haven't visited that on floor 1, please take a look at that. Some of those samplers go back more than 200 years, and they're really phenomenal. So take a look at that. We're going to take a couple of weeks off to rearrange things, and starting on July 12th, we're going to have the Esch Collection Father and Son exhibition. Dr. Arlen Esch, who was a neurosurgeon who is now retired, as a hobby makes pottery. So we will be, and we also sell some of his pottery in our gift shop. So he'll be putting on things on display. He comes from the MT Nest Pottery, and his son is a treen artist. Finally spinned wood and making bowls and other things out of that. So from July 12th to August 31st, they are going to be exhibited in the Gary Semendinger Gallery. So you want to look forward to that. History Camp is coming up in about a month, from July 8th to July 12th. The History Camp is going to be the mysteries of William Elmer Harmon. How did he make his millions? Why did he live so on the frontier of America? How did his great-grandfather, a good 50 years after he died, send letters to people? Some of these mysteries will be uncovered as we try to explore who the Harmon is in Harmon Museum. We'll also be talking about his brother Clifford, and how Clifford got the number 6 pilot's license ever given out in the United States, right after the 2 Wright brothers. The Wright brothers did not get 1, 2, or 3. They got 4 or 5. So there are other things we will be discussing how that is possible. Coming up for Lunch and Learns, on July 17th, we're going to have Letters from California, 1908, 1914. Suzanne Anderson Taylor was our speaker last year when she talked about the coronation. She is a teacher in the Lebanon City Schools. 2 years ago, she did Letters from Paris, all about her grandmother's pen pal from high school who lived in Paris. But after high school, he continued to write, and he wrote about what's happening with Nazi Germany moving in and that sort of thing. Now we're going to be talking about letters from her great-grandfather, who was moved out to California, and what was going on in California, the places he saw, how Los Angeles was booming, and how he met his future wife out there. Interesting family view, especially considering all the letters that are still there. On August 21st, Stitch in Time, the history of quilting. Joyce Lovings Browning will be our speaker. She has been our speaker multiple times, but when you've seen her, she has been Martha Washington, Annie Oakley, Julia Dent Grant, and various other people. But now she's going to reach out and be herself and talk about making quilts. On September 18th, A Few Favorite Haunts by local author Randy Overbeck. He has written a series of books, often with some mystery and supernatural tint to it, and he'll talk about haunted places he's come across. Author Tanya Mitchell will be October 16th. She'll be talking about Nellie Bly, a daredevil reporter. And she has researched Nellie Bly. She writes historical fiction, based on real events. And Nellie Bly, as you may know, was in fact a very famous female reporter well over 100 years ago, 130, 40 years ago, and was quite the newsmaker. Military Women's Memorial, November 20th, Lieutenant Colonel Judy Pearson, retired from the Air Force. We'll be talking about the Military Women's Memorial in Arlington Cemetery. And then Christmas, the 18th of December, we'll have a Christmas concert by the Bones of Cincinnatus. Trombones from Cincinnati, and they are fantastic. They really are. While you're being served your meal, I've got something. This meal is perfect for our topic. Tom Corwin, the gentleman behind me, was born in Bourbon County, Kentucky. This year will be the 230th anniversary of his birth. He was born in 1794, and you're going to be enjoying today chicken in a bourbon glaze. I don't know if that was intentional, but it turned out to be pretty good. On the side, you will have Ohio cream corn. Tom Corwin brand canned sugar corn was canned for well over 50 years. About a half a mile from where we are right now on West Street. From August to mid-October, 6 days a week. It was one of several canneries we had in the area, and people would get their, work 6 days a week and can all this corn. We have an example of a label of Tom Corwin brand sweet corn in our farm tool room. Right next to a tin and pewter sign as you walk in there. So you can recognize Mr. Corwin. And Tom Corwin, as you're going to find out, was considered the greatest wit in Washington. In fact, Senator Charles Sumner said he had great dramatic power. And a Congressman Grosvenor did say his facial expressions were far more impressive than what he was saying. So apparently Tom Corwin was quite the ham. We don't have ham, but with that cream corn, you got bacon. So it's kind of close. So enjoy your Tom Corwin meal, and in about 20 minutes or so, Michael Coyne will introduce your speaker, who happens to be me.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed your meal this afternoon. It's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our featured speaker for today. And it's pretty obvious that we did coordinate our apparel. We planned this because, you see, those are the days that when history questions come in through the door or on the phone, I can answer them. And when there are the problems of running the Historical Society and the museum, then I can dump them onto him. So no one really knows unless we take the badges off. So anyway, when John approached this topic, it was something that's dear to all of us here, this gentleman who was the statesman from Lebanon, Ohio, and from Warren County. I looked up something in the New York Times that said, at the time of his death, Mr. Corwin's political career, covering so long a period, covering our country's history in such important epochs, was distinguished for its ability, its consistency, and its integrity. He held a bond with the Constitution that he would observe with fidelity and interpretation. The country has lost an honored representative. The country has lost a faithful servant, an able statesman, and an honorable man. I guess I'm old enough to wonder what time did we lose the ability to refer to our elected representatives as honorable men? Where are our statesmen? No one that I know of can compare to Thomas Corwin, and we should honor him. And John is going to do that. So with no further ado, our distinguished historian, the historian of Warren County, and the expert on just about everything, except apparel, John Zimkus.
Well, as Mike mentioned, Corwin, unfortunately, he's kind of forgotten today, but he was in his time, and for 50, 60 years afterwards, considered one of the great statesmen in the United States. Not just Ohio, not just Warren County, but in the country. The painting behind me on my one lone slide here is the one which hangs in the state capitol in Columbus. It was done by Marcus Mote, the local artist, the self-taught Quaker artist. And for years, back in 1895, the Western Star has an article, and it talks about how, an article which they copied from the Indianapolis Journal. Mote's daughter went to the Capitol, saw the painting, and it said by an unnamed artist. Well, she knew it was her father, and Marcus knew it was his work, and so he did paint it. He did tell the newspaper. Corwin came to me one day when he was at home from Congress and said the fellows down in Washington seemed to think that nobody in Ohio could do anything, and that he had to refuse to sit for a portrait from an artist there for that reason. He wanted the work done at home. He sat for the portrait a number of times, and I became well acquainted with him. We do have some Marcus Motes in our collection, a good collection of them actually. But the only one I believe that's on now is on the display now is Mount Washington, an oval painting, actually in what we might call the Corwin display, right across from the Seminigger Gallery. It's a beautiful painting. I think you'll enjoy it. Chauncey Depew, back in 1922, he was a president of the New York Central Railroad and at one time a U.S. Senator, said probably Corwin was the most brilliant speaker of the period immediately preceding the Civil War. He went on to say, Corwin may not have been the great statesman perhaps of Henry Clay or Daniel Webster. But Schenck, who from the Harper's Weekly magazine did say, in the strictest sense of the term, he was a superior of either in eloquence, refinement of style, beauty, richness of imagination, and gracefulness in delivery. Carl Sandburg, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Lincoln, said Tom Corwin was the best wit and storyteller in Washington. Born in Bourbon County, Kentucky on July 29th of 1794, his uncle Ichabod came up to what would someday be Lebanon in March of 1796, settled in front of what is now Berry Intermediate School. A couple of years later, his older brother Matthias came up. Matthias had 160 acres between what is now, say, Walgreens and the entrance to Colonial Park north and going down. That is where young Corwin, Tom Corwin, was raised. He spent 4 years in Kentucky. He had 3 pioneer cabins in his life, 2 in Kentucky and 1 in Ohio. He would eventually have one of the finest resumes of any politician in this country. Prosecuting attorney of Warren County, member of the Ohio legislature, governor of the state of Ohio, United States congressman, United States senator, Secretary of Treasury of the United States, back to the United States Congress, ambassador, if you will, or minister to Mexico during the Civil War. And then he actually was one of Abraham Lincoln's 22 pallbearers at his funeral in Washington, D.C. He was called King of the Stump. The stump, his extemporaneous speaking was absolutely marvelous. And compared to Lincoln in many ways, he didn't have much of a formal education. Both born in Kentucky, both moving to a neighboring state, Indiana for Lincoln, Ohio for Corwin, both very little formal education, both fantastic storytellers, both very eloquent at times. Corwin was educated, what little school he had, by Francis Dunlap, the very first teacher in the entire Miami Valley. He had a log cabin school in 1797 and 1798, where on Main Street, where the salt supply now is. If you go, we're only talking about maybe a half a mile going west here on the north side, before you get to Kelly's and the new convenience store there on Neil Armstrong Way. He did not stay very long in that school. He was needed on the farm. He was an excellent horseman. He used to drive his father's wagons to Cincinnati all the time while a teenager. His best friend, A.H. Dunleavy, Anthony Howard Dunleavy, Francis Dunleavy's son, said he drove 4-horse team with great skill, and these wagoners camped at night in the woods together. The young wagon boy, with his ready wit and humor, contributed greatly to their entertainment. During the War of 1812, his older brother, also named Matthias, was an officer, and he took supplies up to the St. Mary's lake area, and it was there that he got the nickname Wagon Boy, and it was one which would stick with him for his entire political career. He was the Wagon Boy. Hurting his knee, he could not work for quite a while, so he made up his time reading his brother's books. And he read the Masters, he read the Bible, he read history, and had such a memory that these things stayed with him and were part of his life for the rest of his life. At the age of 21 in 1815, he began to study law under Joshua Collette, the first local prosecuting attorney of Warren County, later on a president judge, then a judge of the Ohio Supreme Court, and for many, many years, a member of the Miami University Board of Trustees. He distinguished himself mostly in his ability to sway the jury, not so much his knowledge of the law. But during his lifetime, he did have some of the finest legal minds in the area as law partners. Durbin Ward, the owner of Glendower Mansion at one time. A.G. McBurney, at one time Lieutenant Governor of the state of Ohio. The man McBurney Hill is named after. George Sage, his son-in-law, who later on became a member of the Circuit Court in Cincinnati. He was married to Sarah Ross. She was a Quaker girl from Pennsylvania. Her older brother, Thomas Ross, was a congressman. She had twin younger brothers, Phineas, who was a banker, and John, who was a physician. They got married in Phineas's house, what is now called the Corwin House, where the Warren County Engineer's office is. We're talking 2 blocks to the west here, once you cross the North Fork of Turtle Creek. He was married in front of the mantle in his brother-in-law's house. in 1822. In 1855, his daughter Evelina married George Sage on that same spot. And in 1883, his granddaughter, Carolyn Sage, made future recipient of the Medal of Honor, James Madison Burns, at the same spot. His brother-in-law, Phineas, got in trouble with finances. And in 1833, the house was sold at auction. Tom Corwin bought it for $2,333.33. So I'm not quite how you get the third dollar, but that's what it was. It would be about $75,000 in today's money. Corwin did not move into the house. He let his brother-in-law stay there with his family. When Phineas died in 1839, shortly thereafter, Tom Corwin did take over the house, and he lived there for the rest of his life in Lebanon. He and his wife would have 5 children. Catherine, born in 1827, their only son, William Henry, born in 1829, Eveline or Evelina in 1831, Maria Louise in 1834, and Caroline, known as Carrie, in 1836. He was about 5'10", had very black hair, and had piercing black eyes. He was said to be very unusually dark in complexion. One of the things they used to say about him is he was the blackest white man in the United States. He didn't make an awful fuss about that, but with his sense of humor, at one time he was giving a political speech and somebody offered him an umbrella to shade him from the sun, and he said, "I don't think the sun will spoil my complexion." E.D. Mansfield, an author, once said, "There is something in his appearance to attract a second look for a stranger. He was impressive, full of dignity, kindness, and benevolence shone out from his eyes and his face. Countenance pleasing rather than handsome." He was also said to be often the best-dressed man in court. Black pigeon-tailed coat with a vest, often velvet, around the neck a wide and close-fitting cravat, shirts ruffled in front with a white collar. He made quite the attraction. He had honed his oratory skills as a young boy at a debate club, which used to debate in an open area on Silver Street. His speeches were characterized by basically 3 things: his highly developed extemporaneous method. He often didn't have notes at all, maybe a word or two, but he would go on for hours, basically not reading anything. His heavy reliance on humor and his intense and dramatic, forceful delivery. Perhaps now no orator, not from the pulpit, ever drew more frequent illustrations from the Bible, one historian once said. His good friend A.H. Dunleavy, when law students, he and Corwin would repeat each other poems they had admired and had committed to memory. His humor was said to be wondrously quick, perception of whatever was comic, absurd, or ludicrous, a marvelous susceptibility to humorous points of men's society and situations. A contemporary Library of Congress librarian said that great as Corwin's power of humor, there was always kept subordinate to the aim of convincing his audience. To those who, misled by popular rumor of his fastidious quality, expected to hear only the gesture, the grave earnestness and frequent solemnity of his appeal came in the nature of a surprise. Editors of the Herald in New York said in 1844, few men had the ability of Tom Corwin to instruct at the same time as to please the popular assembly. He, as Lincoln, knew that the horse laugh was just as popular or as important as horse sense. and he took advantage of that. His voice was described as cello-like. He never spoke in a venomous enough to have his voice lose its melody and sweetness. Fill the cup of your eyes with tears in a single sentence, one person once said. Shanks from the Harper's Weekly did say, never had a speaker more complete control over his voice, or voice more powerful over his audience. It was soft, round, strong, and flexible. Within the scope of a few brief sentences, it would often expand from the lowest conversational and confidential tone to a climax which would startle his hearers in the remotest of galleries. He also had quite the dramatic facial expressions. It was said that he had great dramatic power, which was evidently natural, as Senator Sumner said. His wonderful effects upon the audience depended more upon his marvelous facial expressions than on anything he said. Now, some people didn't think that was an advantage. One critic once said his grotesquerie and facial grimaces distracted from, if they did not inhibit, the dignity that gives impressiveness to oratory. Sometimes people did not take him seriously because he did rely so much on humor, and he often lamented that. One person once wrote, the words of his speeches were as unlike what came from the lips as a remainder of a bottle of champagne after standing a week is unlike the sparkle beverage which had been uncorked. You had to see the face. Without the face, it just didn't carry over. Rutherford B. Hayes, future president, and a person who looked at Corwin as a mentor, once talked about a speech he gave in 1848 when he was a United States Senator, where he discussed Zachary Taylor, Martin Van Buren, and Senator Lewis Cass from Michigan. According to Hayes, by throwing into his voice and gestures their well-known characteristics, he gave his idea of them. When he spoke of Van Buren, his voice became oily, and he appeared to be a gentlemanly diplomatic politician. He made the first index finger of his right hand, I'll go to the right hand here, go up and down through the air, illustrating the galloping of a fox. Without mentioning Van Buren's name, the fox-like statement was apparent to all. When speaking of Taylor, he put a fierce features and bluff tone of old Zach. There is a story about here in Lebanon when he was he was a member of the East Baptist Church on Warren Street. We're talking about 3 blocks to the north and a half a block to the east. The minister there, Reverend John Finley, often criticized Corwin. Corwin was sitting in what was referred to as the Amen section. It was actually behind the pulpit, so the minister could not see him. And Corwin was there, and the minister was actually attacking some of the things Corwin had been doing. Fitted his remark with unpleasant closeness to his distinguished auditor. Corwin soon grew impatient, then restive, his only weapon of resistance and defense being his face, and strengthening occasionally by a movement of his head. And he responded with facial expressions every time he was attacked, and the members of the congregation felt he won the day, although he did not say a word at all. He often, in a verdict of a trial, wringed verdicts from cold-blooded jurymen in spite of the law, in fact, and justice, because of his persuasive ability. Orson Murray who was an abolitionist, a free thinker, who lived near Maineville, once was refused permission to be a witness in a trial because he did not believe in God, so he would not swear. Therefore, he was excluded from testifying. He was declared incompetent to be a witness on account of his religious beliefs. Corwin went up to Orson Murray, touched him on the shoulder, and said, "My old friend, go home, shave, shear, turn hypocritical, and like the rest of us, then come back and your word will be good as ours." It is said there's a collection, a book called Congressional Antidotes, and there's about a half a dozen or more from Tom Corwin in that book. One of them talks about when he was in the Ohio legislature, and he was supporting a bill, Corwin was, which would outlaw public whipping in the state of Ohio. Another member of the General Assembly, who originally from Connecticut, opposed the bill. The gentleman said that after a man was whipped in his old state, Connecticut, he would immediately leave it. To which Corwin replied, "I know a great many people who have come to Ohio from Connecticut, but I have never before known the reason for their coming." Sometimes his humor, as I mentioned earlier, hurt his positions. Cassius M. Clay was an abolitionist, 1810 to 1903, a Southern aristocrat. He often thought Corwin was a traitor to the cause of abolition because of the way he often joked about it. But on the other hand, after Corwin died in 1865, the Cleveland Herald, an abolitionist paper, did say, "Mr. Corwin was a pioneer in Ohio in the cause of anti-slavery. He was a consistent anti-slavery man years before many of the present ardent friends of freedom dreamed they ever should espouse the cause of the oppressed. And to Mr. Corwin, more than any other man, is due the advance of that sound anti-slavery settlement that marched the politics in Ohio." It is a fact that his uncle, Ichabod Corwin, is said to have hidden slaves as early as 1826 at his home where Berry Intermediate now is. Robert G. Corwin, Tom Corwin's cousin, did write Wilbur Siebert, the great Underground Railroad historian, in 1895, talking about that. There is also some evidence that slaves were hidden in Tom Corwin's house on Main Street, 210 Main Street. His most famous speech in was his first term in the House of Representatives was in 1840. A Michigan state representative named General Isaac F. Crary attacked William Henry Harrison in his attempt to run for president. Corwin lambasted him by attacking. He was a general in the militia, and he talked about all the silly things the militiamen were doing. John Quincy Adams, who was at that time a member of that Congress, referred to Carey after Corwin's speech as the late Mr. Carey of Michigan. The New York newspaper reported Corwin put his antagonist to death in a manner so courteous and refined, with so much good nature and for so many good reasons, that the opponent, guilty or not guilty, feels that he deserves his condemnation. Josiah Morrow, the great historian of Warren County in the late 19th and early 20th century, never before had sarcasm and satire effectively employed in the debate of Congress, and they were all more effective because of the speech abounds in good humor and without bitterness or any unkind or unfriendly allusions to the gentleman to whom he replied. In 1843, John Quincy Adams was coming to Ohio, passed through Lebanon on his way to dedicate the cornerstone of the Cincinnati Observatory. It would be built on a hill which was then called Mount Ida. After he dedicated that cornerstone, they changed the name of the hill to Mount Adams. And then 30 years later, they moved the telescope to Mount Lookout because the coal-burning furnaces of Cincinnati were polluting the air. But on his way there, he spent the night on November 7th here in Lebanon. Corwin at this time was governor of Ohio. There was a reception at the East Baptist Church on Warren Street. Corwin, in his welcome, said, "Be assured, sir, that your fame is cherished with as much sincerity in this small village as in your home in Quincy, Massachusetts. Your character as a scholar, an orator, a statesman, and a patriot is regarded with as much veneration in the Miami Valley as it can be in the banks of the Merrimack River. My humble but welcome task is performed here when, on behalf of these my friends and neighbors, I bid you welcome to the West, welcome to Ohio, welcome to this village, welcome to these people, welcome to the best affections of their hearts." John Quincy Adams, in reply, said, "I must confess that my friend's address has deeply affected me. To that gentleman's voice in the halls of the national legislature in the past years, I was accustomed ever to listen with pleasure, and had been constrained to love and admire him, not less for the qualities of his heart than the strength and vigor of his mind. And when he was called from this seat of Congress to the chief magistrate of the great state of Ohio, I could hardly determine which feeling was more prominent in my bosom, joy at his elevation or regret for the loss of his eloquence in debate, wisdom in counsel in our National Assembly." As I mentioned, Carl Sandburg did refer to him as the best wit in Washington. William Scholer, who was a journalist, politician, and during the Civil War, the Adjutant General of Massachusetts, compared Lincoln and Corwin as far as their stories go. Corwin told stories differently and were in themselves different from President Lincoln's. Corwin appeared to make up as the occasion presented itself. Lincoln appeared to have his stories ready at him, all sorts, and be used when wanted. Some of the other things attributed to him. One time, a somewhat pompous senator was talking to Corwin, and he said to Corwin, "Why, if I didn't have so many irons in the fire, I'd published every one of my speeches for posterity." And Corwin supposedly said, "Take my advice and put your speeches where your irons are." Harper Weekly magazine in 1868 reported that Tom Corwin was approached by a newspaperman from Columbus. Someone asked him, had he heard the latest story from Lewis Campbell, the representative out of the Hamilton, Ohio area. And Corwin said, "Were the stories by Mr. Campbell about himself?" "No, I believe not." "Well, then I never heard them." There was one story, Lloyd Lewis, writing the life story of William Tecumseh Sherman. I don't know if you know this or not, but William Tecumseh Sherman, Charles R. Sherman, died in the Golden Lamb in 1829. He was only 41 years old, was a member of the Ohio Supreme Court. He died of typhoid fever. And Corwin was said, according to Lloyd in his book, with him when he passed away. He told many stories in the book about Corwin's humor. One of them was that Corwin once campaigned in Pennsylvania, and he told some of his best stories, filled with sarcasm and irony and punctuated with famous facial expressions. Yet despite all his efforts, the crowd, nearly 2 hours, acknowledged nary a speck of his witticism. Corwin was simply beside himself in frustration. As he was leaving, one of the men, a Quaker, came up to him and said, "Friend Thomas, at times thee almost made me laugh," realizing then that his entire audience was Quaker. Another one that Lloyd points out, he was in Buffalo, New York. He had previously been speaking in Syracuse, New York, and he had made some comments which were not very positive about Buffalo. So as he was speaking, a delegation of his opponents from Buffalo with banners and organized a group of hecklers, and they kept on yelling, "Louder, louder," and then at last brought the meeting to confusion. They might have succeeded entirely if Corwin had not, all at once, by his own hand, aloft the menace and struck an attitude with all to his enemy. He said, "When the angel Gabriel shall stand with 1 foot on land and 1 foot on sea, with trumpets of doom shall proclaim that time shall be no more, some God-forsaken fool from Buffalo will stand up and cry, 'Louder.'" He, like Lincoln, was sort of self-effacing. Lincoln, of course, was his looks, not considered a very handsome man. Lincoln was once accused of being two-faced, and his reply was, "Well, if I'm two-faced, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" With Corwin, it was his dark complexion. You may recall he was called the blackest white man in the United States. And one time he was visited by some English dignitaries, Sir Morton Petrow, who helped design the Tower of London on the Big Ben area there. And looking at him, Mr. Petrow turned to the man he was with and said, "Is his tribe friendly with the whites?" He often said, he took advantage of that. His most famous speech was a very serious one. It was in the United States Senate. It was a speech against the Mexican War. Texas wanted to become part of the United States. It had been for 9 years or better an independent country, but now they wanted to be part of the United States. The Texicans, if you will, said their border was the Rio Grande. Mexico, however, said that the border was the Nueces River, several hundred miles to the north. A fight developed between American soldiers and the Mexican army, beginning the Mexican War. Corwin thought it was a land-grabbing war. He said, having a letter from a soldier who was there, he read that the citizens were fleeing the American army, and the enemies leaving their homes. Were we their saviors, or were we the enemy? "What is this territory we are taking from Mexico?" he said. "It's his Bunker Hills, his Saratogas, his Yorktimes. The senator from Michigan says we want room. If I were a Mexican, I would tell you, have you not room in your own country to bury your dead? If you come to mine, I will greet you with bloody hands and welcome you to hospitable graves." He then ended his 2.5-hour speech, once again without notes. "Show Mexico that you are sincere when you say you desire nothing by conquest. He predicted that there might even be a civil war over slavery of a new territory. Was it a battle over conquest? Well, besides getting the border down to the Rio Grande, we picked up New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, and parts of Utah. We took 1/3 of what was Mexico. And because of his anti-Mexican war speech, some of the Democrats hated him for that, and hated him for the rest of his life. The Ohio State Journal, a month or so later, said that his speech was an earnest, compassionate advocacy for what he believed to be right against the odds and in the face of all opposition. If any of you are anywhere close to my age, you might recall a TV series called Profiles in Courage, based on JFK's book. The very last episode appeared on May 9th of 1965. It was the story of Tom Corwin, how he could have been President of the United States had he not spoken out against the Mexican War. He also turned his humor sometimes to his family. His only son, William Henry, was attending Granville College, which is now Denison University in Granville, Ohio. In a letter to his son, he wrote, "I am informed that you are seriously injuring your health by studying. Very few men nowadays are likely to injured in that way. If it should kill you yourself by overstudying, it will give me great satisfaction and pleasure to attend your funeral." In writing his wife Sarah way back in 1826, he wrote, "Sarah, yesterday I wrote you fearing that some accident might prevent its safe arrival at Lebanon. I will venture to tax your patience with another sheep. If it should happen that you have received the first, this may be at least assure you that I am in the land of the living, a single fact which I think you might have communicated to me in relations to yourself. The bugle of the stage driver must remind you that there is a conveyance for such trifles twice a week from Lebanon and this place. Well, woman, have there been secrets, they may say, and you of course have yours, and you seem determined to keep them to yourselves. Good night. If I live, I shall be home on Saturday or Sunday. I ever was so weary of Columbus." The Shakers began in 1805, about 4 miles west of us. Malcolm Worley was the very first Shaker. He accepted Shakerism in March of 1805. In the 1840s, several of his children were suing, saying their father was insane when he gave the Shakers his territory. It went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. If the Shakers lost this case, there would be a donut hole in the middle of Union Village. All of Malcolm Worley's property would now go back to his family. Corwin was asked to defend them. And in his defense, he wrote, "George Fox, founder of the Quakers, wore leather breeches and did many eccentric things. Martin Luther threw his inkstand at the devil, but Quakers will not admit that George Fox was crazy, and Protestants will not admit that Martin Luther was crazy. Neither can it be allowed that Malcolm Worley was crazy because by a deed drawn by himself, he chose to give his property to this peculiar people." Well, they won the case, and the heart of Union Village was saved. After being a senator, he resigned when he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury of the United States on President Millard's Fillmore. Some people thought this was rather strange because he was not good with finances. There are stories of someone coming up to him and demanding payment for a debt. When Corwin said he could not pay the bill, the man asked for a promissory note. Corwin gave him gladly, and after the man left, Corwin remarked, "Thank God there's another debt paid." His cousin, Robert Corwin, did say he had no faculty for finance. He knew no more about it than a child. And Corwin often admitted, "I wonder if any other man ever hid from the constable to read letters proposing him for the presidency." Despite his lack of financial ability, he was a very successful Secretary of the Treasury. The Baltimore Clipper newspaper did say, Corwin gave notice that there would neither be bars nor bolts on the doors of his rooms, and that as a public servant he would always be found accessible. It is around this time, and by the way, when he was in Washington, he was living in the Blair House. When he was Secretary of the Treasury, the Blair House, probably the most second famous residence in Washington, D.C., outside of the White House. Just across the street near Lafayette Square. It's where the president-elect often stays the night before his inauguration. But Corwin was living there, and that was the only time his wife, Sarah, moved to Washington. All the other times she stayed in Lebanon. His years in Congress, his years as a U.S. Senator. Toward the end of his political career, the new Republican Party began. Some of the problems he had was that the Democrats could not forgive him for what he said about the Mexican War. He was resented for being an idealist as a practical politician rather than keeping the party line. The radicals thought that he was too much an appeaser. So he often was looked as an old Whig. You might even call him a rhino in today's words. Corwin was offered, he visited Abraham Lincoln in his first week in office, and they tried to figure out who to send to Mexico as a representative of the United States. And after meeting, the choice became Corwin. Although he did not speak Spanish, the Mexicans did remember him as being anti-Mexican War. He also, just prior to that, was involved in something called the Corwin Amendment. Many historians, or many people who aren't historians, look at this amendment and think that Corwin liked slavery. It was an amendment made up of congressmen from all of the 11 states, 3 men from each. There's more than 11. I think there's 33 states. One representative from each of the 33 states. And it was an amendment which proposed that slavery stay in the United States. And some people in the 20th century are looking at that and saying, how could Corwin say that? Well, as many a historian has said, you can't judge 19th century actions with a 21st century mind. What was he trying to do? He was trying to save the United States. There was a fear that the United States would disintegrate. And with that disintegration, there would be no more. The only way was to somehow appease the states which were succeeding. But it was for naught. When it was finally completed, South Carolina had already left the Union. David McCullough said, you can't, people don't live in the past. It was their present. You have to think with their mindset. So in a letter to Abraham Lincoln, addressed to your eyes only, if the states are no more harmonious in their feelings and opinions than these 33 representative men, then appalling as the idea is, we must dissolve, and the long and bloody Civil War must follow. I cannot comprehend the madness of these times. Southern men are theoretically crazy. Extreme Northern men are practical fools. The latter are really quite as mad as the former. Treason is in the air around us everywhere. It goes by the name of patriotism. Men in Congress boldly avow it, and the public offices are full of acknowledged secessionists. God alone, I fear, can help us. 4 or 5 states are gone. Others are driving before the gale. I have looked on this horrible picture till I have been able to gaze on it with perfect calmness. I think if you live, you may take the oath of office. Carl Sandburg wrote 68-year-old Tom Corwin, to whom words were coined of freedom, and fun between man and men, good fellows, to whom war was betrayal, propaganda, lies, disease, gangrene, filth, famine, blood puddles, boys dying amid rain, mud, and rats. An old house dear to him was falling to pieces, and in old rooms where he had for 30 years forgathered with northern and southern friends, it seems to him the ruin would arrive. Black bats and echoing emptiness, with the spiders weaving their webs in forsaken corners, and the night owl singing a watch song of lonesome moonlight. So as I mentioned, Corwin is sent to Mexico. He was successful. He was definitely tiptoeing through there, because if you know your Mexican history, there was Benito Juarez as the president of Mexico, but there was also Archduke Ferdinand, who was put on the throne of Mexico by Napoleon III. And he thought the Mexican people wanted him. So Corwin tried to deal only with Juarez, but he was successful. A Confederate General B said, "The tone of the Juarez government has been hostile to our cause, and at his dictation various measures have been initiated calculated to annoy and injure us. They have finally decreed martial law on the frontier and the export and import of any articles whatever from Texas." And the main thing is that Corwin had done that. In thanks for Corwin, Benito Juarez did give him a picture made of feathers, and we have it hanging up in the little Corwin room across from the Semendinger Gallery. A plumeraria, I believe is the correct pronunciation. It is a 2 girls on a swing. It's not very big, but it's not painted. It's done by feathers. Toward the latter part of his life, he thought his jokes made him unsuccessful. He once heard Don Piatt, running for office, and he made a joke, and Corwin said, "Don't do it, my boy. You should remember the crowd always looks up to the ringmaster and down at the clown. It resents which it amuses. The clown is the more clever fellow of the two, but he is despised. If you would be successful in life, you must be solemn as an ass. All great monuments are built over solemn asses." So even in talking about not being funny, he was being funny. He served as President Lincoln one more time by being one of the 22 official pallbearers in April of 1865. Also there was Lieutenant General U.S. Grant and several other dignitaries. On December 16th, He was at the home of a Mr. Wetmore, a military agent from Ohio, and all this great collection of Ohio men were there. Two future presidents were there. One of them was Rutherford B. Hayes. And Hayes recalled some almost 30 years later, when Corwin was in the midst of his jestings, Senator Wade, who had been listening intently, suddenly asked, "They say, Corwin, that Mexico wants to annex the United States. What do you think of that?" Corwin's face changed from the gay to grave. His eyes became serious, and everyone bent forward to hear what he might say. He raised his hands, attempted to speak. His lips moved, but no words came. His hands still moved in gesture. And then it was seen that something was the matter, and we moved back to give him air. He raised himself suddenly from his seat, reached forward his hands, and fell to the arms of friends. We carried him into the next room and laid him upon the bed. He never spoke again. Also there was future President James A. Garfield. In 1878, he recalls the same event. A large party of Ohio people were assembled in the house of Mr. Wetmore, a military agent of Ohio, and Corwin was in his happiest vein of anecdotes. He occupied a sofa with his friends seated on either hand, and many seated in front of him as could be get within reach. They were listening to one of his inimitable stories, in the course of which he rose to illustrate some point of an anecdote, and while making a gesture with both hands, was stricken with paralysis and fell forward. I caught him in my arms, and Whitelaw Reid, who stood beside me, aided in carrying him to the bed in the adjoining room. He spoke once or twice on the way, and he laid him down, and he never spoke again. Slightly different, but two future presidents. A third unidentified eyewitness said, "In 10 minutes after he had entered the room, I saw from the distance men collecting and compacting around him. Some were seated by him, some stood erect by their chairs, some leaned and pressed eagerly forward between the more inner circles of listeners and pushed their ears forward to hear the words and whispers which came from the center figure of the circle. Some sat, some stood, some kneeled, all leaned forward to listen. His youth, within its inimitable charm and graces, seemed to be for a moment to have come to him again. There were once more the flow of humor, the sparkle of merriment, the glow of enthusiasm, the flash of wit, the charms of anecdotes and illustrations. There his wondrous play of features were made by Corwin. Men came repeatedly out of the presence of that seat that night, exclaiming, 'There is but one Corwin.'" He died 2 days later. There was a good deal of honors given to him. In the United States Senate, Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase said, "Great were his titles of honors worn at the bar, and the legislature halls, and in the executive councils, but at this moment they seem insignificant in comparison with the admiration, love, and veneration which gathered around him as a man. Let others call him senator, secretary, and minister. Let us call him man, our friend." The funeral was actually held in Whitmore's house. Some family members came. It was held on December 20th, 2 days after he died. There were a large number of people there. The body was laid in a handsome coffin of black walnut, covered with black cloth, trimmed with silver and lined with white satin, and placed in the center of one of the upper rooms. Around 3 o'clock, it was closed to all those who had come to see him. One Ohio farmer said, "Can't I see him? I used to hear his speeches in my county, and I'd like to see him." Judges of the Supreme Court there, senators, Secretary of State, commanders of the Army. His daughter, Louisa Corwin there, her brother-in-law, and Corwin's son-in-law, George Sage, was there. Mrs. Smith of Washington, a cousin of Mrs. Corwin, was there. The undertaker took a few steps toward the coffin. At that moment, according to newspaper accounts, a petite female figure in deep mourning glided. Her hand gently touched the cold hand, and then came a deep sigh. Tears fell fast, overflowing her eyes. And what tears! Tears wrung from the depth of a daughter's heart, and warmed in the fire of the holiest affections, a daughter's love. The sorrowing daughter was quickly removed from the apartment, and the lid closed. A waiting hearse was there. Police officers carried the coffin to the hearse. According to the newspaper, passing the hallway on the ground floor, they noticed a colored woman, the servant of the family, her head wrapped in a white handkerchief, standing in the recess of the side door, hiding her face in her hands and sobbing as if her heart would break. That was from the Washington Chronicle newspaper. The Western Star reprinted that article, but then identified the colored woman identified was a former slave in Washington City. 15 years ago, she was about to be sent south. She was the wife of Governor Corwin's body servant. The governor bought her from her master, paid full price for her, and gave her her freedom. A committee of 5 men were set aside to accompany the body to Washington. 2 of them were once again Rutherford B. Hayes and James A. Garfield, future presidents of the United States. 16 pallbearers accompanied or walked beside the hearse as it went to the train station. Among them were Chief Justice Samuel P. Chase, Justice Noah Swain, Seward, Secretary of State, United States Senators Ben Wade from Ohio, and U.S. Senator John Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman's younger brother, the mayor of Washington, Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, Robert C. Schenck of Ohio, and Congressman Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, the head of the radical Republicans in Washington. A couple of days later, the 22nd, the funeral took place in Lebanon. His body lay in state in the library of his house, 2 blocks in that direction. If you walk into the front door, it's immediately on the left. Once again, they talked about the coffin, how beautiful it was. There was simply a small plaque on the coffin. Tom Corwin, born July 29th, 1794, died December 18th, 1865. The procession to the cemetery began first with the Masonic Lodge. Corwin was the Ohio Grand Master of the Masons in 1828. The mourning carriages, pallbearers, the hearse, more pallbearers, family members of the deceased, members of the Ohio Bar, mourners, and citizens in carriage and on foot. Among the 8 pallbearers were A.H. Dunleavy and A.G. McBurney. They went first to the East Baptist Church, and then procession went on to the cemetery. The body was then placed in the crypt for being buried later. 6 months later, on the 12th of June, Corwin was eventually buried. That crypt may very well be the vault we still have in a Lebanon cemetery. They had waited for his son, his only son, William H. Corwin, to come back from his mission in Mexico. So he had returned on June 12th, on the Tuesday before June 12th, and they were about to have the ceremony once again. Once again, he was placed in the church. His body had been embalmed, so it had been preserved. His son had, according to the Western Star, the melancholy satisfaction of being present with the family and relatives when the body of his venerable father was committed to its final resting place. Except for his sister in a distant part of Illinois, His relatives were all there. And then the anonymous writer wrote, "To him who pens this short notice, the scene awakened afresh the association of a whole lifetime. Some 68 years before, he had first met the deceased in the school located about 100 yards from the spot where his remains of this honored companion was then being deposited for their final resting place. And from that early in their lives to the deceased, they had been almost constant companions in social friendship, education, and professional pursuits. Their association ended at the very spot where it commenced more than 70 years before and had never been interrupted by the slightest discord." It's not identified, but I'm convinced that is Anthony Howard Dunleavy talking about his good friends. Corwin once said, facetiously, that his tombstone should read, "Dearly beloved by his family, universally despised by Democrats, useful in life only to knaves and pretended friends." In 1899, Robert Ingersoll, a political leader and an orator once, on visiting Corwin's grave, said, "In his laughter there was logic, in his wit wisdom, and in his humor philosophy and philanthropy. He was a supreme artist. He painted pictures with words. He knew the strength and the velocity of verbs, the color and the light and shade of adjectives. He was a sculptor in speech, changing stones to statues. He was natural and had a spontaneity of winds and waves. He was the greatest orator of his time, the grandest that ever stood beneath our flag." Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about Mr. Corwin? Yes, ma'am. Well, yeah, the question was, did he live in Lebanon when he was governor? Actually, he did. There was no governor's residence in Columbus. And at that time, before the revised Ohio Constitution in 1850, the governor had very little power. Corwin once joked all he could do was pardon prisoners and appoint notary publics. But yeah, so he really didn't have much to do as governor. And he ran for re-election and he was defeated. And that was the only political defeat he had ever had. Any other questions? Yeah, yes, another. Well, did he live much of an estate? Probably not, to tell you the truth. After his death, his son-in-law, George Sage, took over the house. And he and his wife, Evelina Corwin Sage, lived there. Man, it was their home for another 33 years. They both died in 1898. So I imagine there was a great deal of debts to be paid. So he was very generous, but he wasn't very good at thinking about himself as finances go. Yes. He was 72. We have in the Harmon Museum about not quite a dozen of these. They're called The Spirit of Tom Corwin. And most of them are open. And if you go to certain exhibits, they'll talk to you about how Corwin related to these. So in front of a little bank display, how his brother-in-law, Phineas Ross, was a banker. In front of the Corwin room, if you will, across from the gallery, there's one on his family, and there's also one on him being the minister to Mexico. And you'll find some other ones. So they tell little tiny things all about Corwin. Also, you will find in that Corwin room The mantle, which once was in the house, the Corwin crest, a bust of Corwin done about 150, 160 years ago, and some photographs and other things. And his desk from the U.S. Senate. In the Victorian Gallery, we have his private desk. So we actually have two desks that belong to Tom Corwin in our displays. And as I mentioned earlier, he belongs up there with Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. He's just sort of unfortunately forgotten today, but quite the individual. Don't forget, there's a discount at the gift shop. Your last chance to see samplers of A Simpler Time. You had a question? I really don't know where the dark complexion comes from. He was not Indian. His family was New Jersey. Both his father and uncle were northern New Jersey folks. So there, I'm not quite sure where it came from. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I hope to see you next month. Take care.